That being said, when we evaluate sanctions effectiveness, we differentiate between the different purposes. Most people focus on sanctions as if they're intended to coerce a change in an actor's behavior. That's where most of the public discourse is, most of the policy discourse, most of the academic discourse is focused on this question. When we look at sanctions, however, we differentiate between different purposes because most sanctions regimes have simultaneously multiple purposes. Just let me put in context the sanctions, the UN sanctions on DPRK. This is by far the most extensive sanctions regime in place by the UN today. They're approximating comprehensive measures. They're non-discriminating, as we just heard, and we've developed a sanctions discrimination scale where we compare all the UN, 15 in-place UN sanctions regimes. 14 of the 15 are between 1 and 3 on our 6-point scale. DPRK is at level 5, which means these are approximating comprehensive measures. And of course, they're accompanied also by EU and US autonomous measures. Now, just put in historical context, the sanctions, as just pointed out by our colleague, were introduced in 2006. These were focused on weapons of mass destruction, fairly targeted measures. Finance and transportation were added between 2013 and 15. Very broad sectoral measures on petroleum and coal exports were applied starting in 2016, and all of the above, plus fishing rights, remittances from foreign workers were applied 2017 to the present. So these are different ways of looking at the development gradually, and I would argue that cyber is probably the next frontier. The scope is individuals are being targeted. This is just the numbers of corporations, individuals. Non-economic sectors, diplomatic, arms, luxury items, nuclear materials, economic sectors. Now these are much less discriminating when you're basically sanctioning an entire sector: fishing, export of labor, textiles, coal. Non-discriminating measures are measures that affect the entire population. So they're technically targeted, but they're so non-discriminating that they're affecting the entire population. Finance, petroleum, and transportation would all fall into that domain. Why UN sanctions are important? This is coming out of a comparison of the sanctions on Iran versus DPRK. It's very different from the Iran sanctions regime, because there the US sanctions were the most important for the regime. UN sanctions in this case are implemented by both Russia and China, although not consistently. I'll say a bit more about that later. And in this case, the US isn't applying the kind of extraterritorial pressure it's applying on European financial institutions in the Iran case. In fact, it doesn't need to, because most banks have voluntarily, for reasons of commercial and concern about penalties from the US Department of Treasury, have already simply de-risked and are not actually financing transactions. This, by the way, is creating problems. I should have mentioned I do a lot of work with the UN sanctions branch, including a training course, and we were recently just talking about how to create safe banking channels to get relief in for humanitarian goods. Even United Nations agencies are having difficulty at present on this. That's because of the broad de-risking that's taking place. The U.S. maximum pressure strategy we heard about earlier today, I would argue, has reached its limits, and now there is evidence of erosion of a consensus at the UN on these sanctions. So that's something I'm sure that DPRK is watching as well. All right, in terms of sanctions effectiveness, I was asked to talk about this. It's a question that people always ask about sanctions. It's, well, they don't work, do they? And they always hit the wrong people and so on. Let me just say something analytically about how to think about sanctions effectiveness. Somewhat the wrong way. First, DPRK is a situation where sanctions are probably least likely to be effective. And this is for reasons those of you who know much better than I do the history of the regime itself. And coercing a regime to change its behavior is difficult in the best of circumstances. In fact, I'll say more about that in a moment. Constraining an actor in its behavior is less challenging, but increasing cost doesn't necessarily lead to major cuts in existing programs. Again, here referring to the nuclear program in DPRK. Of course, North Korea has a history of self-reliant development. We were hearing earlier today about the effective ways in which it's managing. I thought very interesting, Peter Hayes over the lunchtime talking about the ways in which it's managing the energy and petroleum cutbacks. But with a history of self-reliant development, Juche, and the nature of the state, this is one of the last remaining command economies. So they're more capable than most countries in terms of widespread, managing to muddle through very broad sanctions. And of course, the sanctions paradox is that sanctions are more effective on highly integrated economies, and North Korea has a history of not being a highly integrated economy. So this is again why I think it's a least likely case for effectiveness. That being said, when we evaluate sanctions effectiveness, we differentiate between the different purposes. Most people focus on sanctions as if they're intended to coerce a change in an actor's behavior. That's where most of the public discourse is, most of the policy discourse, most of the academic discourse is focused on this question. When we look at sanctions, however, we differentiate between different purposes because most sanctions regimes have simultaneously multiple purposes, not only to coerce a change in behavior, but also to constrain an actor. In fact, if you look particularly at the nuclear components of the Security Council resolutions, you'll see very specific efforts to try to make it more costly, force a change in strategy, make it more difficult for North Korea to continue its nuclear program. That would be a constraining purpose, not just ending the program, but making it more difficult to sustain. A third, however, and I think very important reason for applying sanctions, another purpose is to signal targets, not just the targets, but also others, the larger international community. There are sanctions to be applied in cases of violation of non-proliferation treaty agreements. So the signaling is not just to DPRK, it's more generally to the rest of the international community. All sanctions regimes, I would argue, are engaged in normative signaling. This is the part of sanctions that's probably the least well understood or appreciated, but it's in fact, I think, one of the main reasons why sanctions are applied as often as they are. Now, I mentioned the app that we've developed. It's free, downloadable. If you're interested, I can say more about that later. But in sanctions app evaluation, we say that the DPRK sanctions are intended to coerce DPRK to denuclearize and return to the NPT. That's right out of the text of the resolutions. It's intended to constrain the DPRK from developing nuclear and missile technology programs. And it's signaling DPRK and, as I said, others support for the non-proliferation regime. So if you're just reading the collection of the text of the resolutions over time, these are the multiple purposes of the UN sanctions. Implementation and evasion. Well, since I just came back from attending the interpanel workshop of the panel of experts, the annual meeting in New York, I can say something from the latest DPRK panel of experts report. And they argue that access to the international financial system continues through the use of diplomats to facilitate economic and banking transactions. The use of cyberspace and cyber attacks, up to $2 billion in revenue over the past couple of years, again, through the use of diplomatic personnel, probably most famously the simultaneous hack on 30 different SWIFT accounts on the same day a couple of years ago. Ship-to-ship transfers, increasingly using smaller and smaller craft. Interestingly now, the Chinese are dissenting on this at the Security Council, challenging the monitoring team of the panel of experts report on the veracity of some of their claims and some of the material in their most recent report. Petroleum import limits for 2019 this year were probably exceeded by April of 2019. But interestingly now, Russia applied a hold, and so the limit was not applied. And so therefore, the U.S. is arguing that the limits have already been exceeded in the first quarter of the year, first third of the year, actually. But there's no further barring of petroleum imports at this point in time. So even though this is another example of the relaxed implementation from a permanent member of the Council. And as I said, alluded to a moment ago, there's growing permanent 5 disagreement over the implementation of the measures. So this is just a sense of bringing some of the geopolitics discussion this morning into the geoeconomics this afternoon. Russia, as I mentioned, just on both petroleum and coal, and China on the ship-to-ship transfers and access on fishing. So these are just coming out of the debates in the Sanctions Committee and in the Council itself. And I would argue that Russia and China are signaling through implementation their reticence about the continuation of broad, non-discriminating measures. Because privately, certainly in conversations I've had with Russian diplomats in New York, they are in favor, and I think China as well, in favor of seeing some kind of sanctions relief being offered now. Since it's not being offered because the resolution is in place and isn't up for renewal or review, the way to signal your disaffection is simply to drag your feet on implementation. I think that's what's happening at the moment. Coercion is ineffective because although the DPRK has publicly committed to denuclearization, that's the policy outcome, The U.S. bilateral initiatives are much more important than the UN sanctions, and so therefore we don't see significant change at this point on coercing change in behavior. With regard to constraint, we also argue ineffective. Why? Yes, we talked about not all missile development, important long range, but we talked about suspension of both testing, nuclear tests and long range missiles, but not missile development altogether. That's the policy outcome. The UN sanctions contribution to that outcome is, yes, they constrain, but perhaps the destruction of the nuclear test site was also more significant in constraining further development. I'd be interested in, those of you who know that much better than I do, assessment of that. Signaling, we actually argue that the UN sanctions have been effective. There's a very strong stigmatization, and obviously the DPRK regime certainly is feeling the effects of both the stigmatization as well as the economic impacts, and the norm has been very strongly articulated in the UN Security Council resolutions that have been passed.